My parents didn't try to marry me off because they cared about my future. They did it because a wealthy businessman held their failing company in his hands, and I was part of the deal. What started as one uncomfortable family dinner uncovered years of hidden contracts, financial manipulation, and a revenge plan that had been waiting for my family long before I was born. If you think you know where the story is going, trust me, you don't. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, if your own parents asked you to marry someone to save the family business, what would you do? Now let me tell you exactly what happened. My name is Freya Garcia, and if someone had told me 3 years ago that my own parents would try to negotiate my future like it was part of a business transaction, I would have laughed in disbelief. Back then, I believed family always protected each other. I believed that even during difficult times, parents would put their children's happiness above everything else. I was wrong. What happened to me started with a dinner invitation that seemed completely ordinary. By the time that evening ended, my entire understanding of my family had changed forever. At the time, I was 28 years old and living in Seattle, Washington. I worked as a forensic accountant for a consulting firm that specialized in investigating corporate fraud, hidden assets, and financial misconduct. My job required patience, attention to detail, and a willingness to question things that most people accepted without hesitation. Ironically, those same skills would eventually expose the biggest deception of my life. Outside of work, my life was quiet. I rented a modern apartment near downtown, spent weekends hiking whenever the weather cooperated, and enjoyed having enough independence to make my own decisions. Marriage wasn't something I rejected, but it also wasn't something I planned to rush into simply because people expected it. My parents, Daniel Garcia and Linda Garcia, had different ideas. They lived nearly an hour away in Bellevue, where they had spent decades building what appeared to be a successful family business. My father owned a regional logistics company that transported commercial goods throughout the Pacific Northwest. Growing up, I had always assumed the company was thriving. My parents lived comfortably, entertained business associates frequently, and never seemed worried about money. At least, that was what they wanted everyone to believe. One Thursday afternoon, my mother called unexpectedly. "Freya," she said warmly, "your father and I would love for you to come over for dinner this Saturday. It's been too long." Nothing about her voice sounded unusual. I agreed, without thinking twice. Saturday arrived with cool autumn air and gray skies that seemed determined to keep the sun hidden. After finishing a few errands, I drove to my parents' house carrying a bottle of wine and expecting nothing more than another family dinner. The moment I walked through the front door, something felt different. The dining table was set more formally than usual. Crystal glasses reflected the soft lighting above us. My mother had prepared dishes she normally reserved for holiday celebrations. Even my father, who usually wore casual clothes at home, had changed into a tailored suit. It didn't feel like dinner. It felt like a meeting. Before I could ask why, the front door opened again. A tall man walked inside carrying an expensive leather briefcase instead of a gift. He appeared to be in his late 40s, maybe early 50s. His dark suit fit perfectly, his silver watch looked more expensive than my car, and he carried himself with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. My mother smiled brightly. "Freya, this is Victor Langford." Victor extended his hand with practiced charm. "It's wonderful to finally meet you." Finally? That single word immediately caught my attention. We shook hands politely before sitting down. Throughout dinner, Victor dominated nearly every conversation. He spoke about international investments, commercial real estate, charitable foundations, luxury travel, and business acquisitions. Every story subtly reminded everyone at the table that he was wealthy, connected, and successful. Whenever I tried discussing my own career, he redirected the conversation back to himself. At first, I assumed he was simply arrogant. Then I noticed something stranger. My parents barely spoke. Instead, they watched us. Every smile, every question, every reaction. It was almost as if they were observing an interview rather than participating in dinner. When dessert arrived, my father cleared his throat. "Freya," he began carefully, "Victor has expressed an interest in getting to know you better." I looked from my father to my mother. Neither of them smiled naturally. They looked nervous. Victor leaned forward. I believe two mature adults should explore opportunities when life presents them. I stared at him for several seconds before responding. Are you asking me on a date? He smiled confidently. I'm suggesting we consider a future together. The room became completely silent. I laughed softly because I genuinely thought it was a joke. No one else laughed. My mother reached across the table. Freya, we've discussed this carefully. My stomach tightened. You've discussed what? My father answered. We think Victor would make an excellent husband.
Not boyfriend.
Not someone to get to know. Husband. The word landed like a stone. I looked directly at Victor. I don't even know you. That can change. I've spent less than an hour speaking with you. Sometimes important decisions shouldn't be delayed. I felt my pulse rising. I don't make life-changing decisions based on one dinner. Victor remained calm. I admire practicality. His confidence irritated me more than his proposal. Then I remembered something. Weren't you married before? He nodded without hesitation. My parents didn't try to marry me off because they cared about my future. They did it because a wealthy businessman held their failing company in his hands, and I was part of the deal. What started as one uncomfortable family dinner uncovered years of hidden contracts, financial manipulation, and a revenge plan that had been waiting for my family long before I was born. If you think you know where the story is going, trust me, you don't. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, if your own parents asked you to marry someone to save the family business, what would you do? Now, let me tell you exactly what happened. My name is Freya Garcia, and if someone had told me 3 years ago that my own parents would try to negotiate my future like it was part of a business transaction, I would have laughed in disbelief. Back then, I believed family always protected each other. I believed that even during difficult times, parents would put their children's happiness above everything else. I was wrong. What happened to me started with a dinner invitation that seemed completely ordinary. By the time that evening ended, my entire understanding of my family had changed forever. At the time, I was 28 years old and living in Seattle, Washington. I worked as a forensic accountant for a consulting firm that specialized in investigating corporate fraud, hidden assets, and financial misconduct. My job required patience, attention to detail, and a willingness to question things that most people accepted without hesitation. Ironically, those same skills would eventually expose the biggest deception of my life. Outside of work, my life was quiet. I rented a modern apartment near downtown, spent weekends hiking whenever the weather cooperated, and enjoyed having enough independence to make my own decisions. Marriage wasn't something I rejected, but it also wasn't something I planned to rush into simply because people expected it. My parents, Daniel Garcia and Linda Garcia, had different ideas. They lived nearly an hour away in Bellevue, where they had spent decades building what appeared to be a successful family business. My father owned a regional logistics company that transported commercial goods throughout the Pacific Northwest. Growing up, I had always assumed the company was thriving. My parents lived comfortably, entertained business associates frequently, and never seemed worried about money. At least, that was what they wanted everyone to believe. One Thursday afternoon, my mother called unexpectedly. Freya, she said warmly, your father and I would love for you to come over for dinner this Saturday. It's been too long. Nothing about her voice sounded unusual. I agreed without thinking twice. Saturday arrived with cool autumn air and gray skies that seemed determined to keep the sun hidden. After finishing a few errands, I drove to my parents' house carrying a bottle of wine and expecting nothing more than another family dinner. The moment I walked through the front door, something felt different. The dining table was set more formally than usual. Crystal glasses reflected the soft lighting above us. My mother had prepared dishes she normally reserved for holiday celebrations. Even my father, who usually wore casual clothes at home, had changed into a tailored suit. It didn't feel like dinner. It felt like a meeting. Before I could ask why, the front door opened again. A tall man walked inside carrying an expensive leather briefcase instead of a gift. He appeared to be in his late 40s, maybe early 50s. His dark suit fit perfectly, his silver watch looked more expensive than my car, and he carried himself with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. My mother smiled brightly. Freya, this is Victor Langford. Victor extended his hand with practiced charm. It's wonderful to finally meet you. Finally? That single word immediately caught my attention. We shook hands politely before sitting down. Throughout dinner, Victor dominated nearly every conversation. He spoke about international investments, commercial real estate, charitable foundations, luxury travel, and business acquisitions. Every story subtly reminded everyone at the table that he was wealthy, connected, and successful. Whenever I tried discussing my own career, he redirected the conversation back to himself. At first, I assumed he was simply arrogant. Then I noticed something stranger. My parents barely spoke. Instead, they watched us. Every smile, every question, every reaction. It was almost as if they were observing an interview rather than participating in dinner. When dessert arrived, my father cleared his throat. Freya, he began carefully, Victor has expressed an interest in getting to know you better. I looked from my father to my mother. Neither of them smiled naturally. They looked nervous. Victor leaned forward. I believe two mature adults should explore opportunities when life presents them. I stared at him for several seconds before responding. Are you asking me on a date? He smiled confidently. I'm suggesting we consider a future together. The room became completely silent. I laughed softly because I genuinely thought it was a joke. No one else laughed. My mother reached across the table. Freya, we've discussed this carefully. My stomach tightened. You've discussed what? My father answered. We think Victor would make an excellent husband. Not boyfriend. Not someone to get to know. Husband. The word landed like a stone. I looked directly at Victor. I don't even know you. That can change. I've spent less than an hour speaking with you. Sometimes important decisions shouldn't be delayed. I felt my pulse rising. I don't make life-changing decisions based on one dinner. Victor remained calm. I admire practicality. His confidence irritated me more than his proposal. Then I remembered something. Weren't you married before? He nodded without hesitation. Twice. And both ended in divorce? They did. My mother interrupted before I could continue. Relationships are complicated, sweetheart. I looked back at Victor. What happened? He shrugged almost casually. We simply wanted different things. It sounded rehearsed. Too rehearsed. Everyone at the table accepted the explanation except me. As dinner ended, Victor thanked my parents, shook my hand once again, and promised he hoped to see me soon. The second his car disappeared down the street, I turned toward my parents. What was that? My father folded his arms. A serious opportunity. It felt like an arranged marriage. No one is forcing you. Then why didn't anyone ask me before inviting him? My mother's expression changed. Because we knew you would refuse without meeting him. I still refuse. Neither of them spoke. Instead, they exchanged a quick glance. It lasted only a second. But I noticed it. It wasn't disappointment. It looked more like panic. That reaction confused me more than anything else. Over the next several days, the pressure intensified. My mother called every evening. My father sent long messages explaining how stable, generous, and respected Victor was. Even distant relatives suddenly contacted me, encouraging me to keep an open mind. It felt coordinated, almost scripted. The strangest part was that no one ever asked whether I actually liked Victor. They only talked about what a wonderful decision the marriage would be. For everyone. That choice of words bothered me. Not wonderful for me. Wonderful for everyone. Late one evening, after another uncomfortable phone call with my parents, I drove to their house without telling them. I intended to end the discussion once and for all. As I approached the front porch, I noticed the living room lights were still on. Before ringing the doorbell, I heard voices through the slightly open kitchen window. It was my father. His voice sounded tense. I know, he whispered into the phone. He paused, listening carefully. Then he said something that made every hair on my arm stand up. She still doesn't know she's part of the agreement. My heart stopped. Part of what agreement? Before I could hear another word, the floorboard beneath my feet creaked loudly. Inside the house, complete silence followed. Then footsteps began moving toward the front door. The moment I heard footsteps approaching the front door, instinct took over. I hurried back toward my car as quietly as I could, forcing myself not to run. Every nerve in my body screamed that I had just overheard something I was never supposed to hear. By the time I reached the driver's seat, my hands were shaking. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove away without turning on the radio. My father's words echoed in my mind over and over again. She still doesn't know she's part of the agreement. Part of an agreement. Not a relationship. Not a proposal. An agreement. As a forensic accountant, I had spent years examining contracts designed to hide the truth behind polished language. People rarely chose words by accident, especially in business. And my father had spent his entire life in business. When I arrived home that night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed every conversation from the dinner. Victor's confidence. My parents' unusual silence. The way everyone avoided answering direct questions. The pressure that followed afterward. Viewed separately, each moment seemed harmless. Viewed together, they formed a pattern. Someone wanted me to make a decision without asking enough questions. That alone was enough to make me suspicious. The following Monday, I returned to work as if nothing had happened. Our office occupied 3 floors inside a modern glass building overlooking Elliott Bay. Employees bustled through the hallways carrying laptops, coffee cups, and stacks of financial reports. Normally, I enjoyed the organized chaos. Today, I barely noticed it. I sat at my desk and opened several public databases that my team regularly used during fraud investigations. Everything I searched was completely legal. Corporate registrations, property ownership, court filings, civil lawsuits, business licenses, public financial disclosures. I began with Victor Langford. Within minutes, I found dozens of companies connected to his name. Real estate firms, investment partnerships, holding companies, private trusts. None of that was unusual for someone with significant wealth. Then I searched his divorce records. The first marriage had lasted nearly 9 years. The second lasted just under 4. Neither case involved dramatic courtroom battles. Both divorces appeared surprisingly quiet. Confidential settlements, mutual agreements, very little public information. Again, nothing illegal. But something still bothered me. People with Victor's financial profile rarely left so little behind unless someone had worked very hard to keep everything private. During lunch, I searched property records connected to his former spouses. That was when I noticed the first inconsistency. Several expensive properties previously owned by Victor's first wife had been transferred into a trust shortly before the divorce. Months later, those same properties belonged to one of Victor's investment companies. I frowned. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe not. I repeated the process for the second marriage. Different properties. Different trust. Exactly the same result. Assets slowly disappeared from the wife's ownership before the marriage officially ended. Interesting. Very interesting. I printed several documents and highlighted every transfer date. Patterns rarely lied. People did. Over the next 2 weeks, my investigation expanded. Every evening after work, I continued digging through financial records from my apartment. I barely watched television anymore. Dinner often became takeout eaten in front of my computer. The deeper I looked, the stranger everything became. Victor never directly received valuable assets after marrying someone. Instead, ownership passed through multiple companies before eventually arriving inside organizations he controlled indirectly. Legally speaking, the trail looked clean. Financially speaking, it was carefully engineered. Then I decided to examine my father's company. At first, I expected nothing unusual. Instead, I found something that made my stomach sink. Roughly 18 months earlier, my father's logistics business had taken out several large private loans. The lender wasn't a bank. The lender was one of Victor Langford's investment firms. I stared at the documents for several long seconds. No, I whispered to myself. There had to be another explanation. I opened additional filings. The loan amounts were enormous, far larger than I had imagined. Even worse, repayment deadlines were approaching rapidly. If those loans weren't repaid, Victor's company could legally seize substantial business assets under the signed agreements. Suddenly, everything my parents had said made sense. If you love this family, if you care about your father's future, those weren't emotional pleas. They were desperate attempts to prevent financial collapse. But one question remained. Why involve me? Late Friday evening, I discovered the answer. Buried inside another corporate filing was a draft trust registration connected to a planned family asset restructuring. The trust had not yet become active. One condition remained incomplete. Marriage. Specifically, my marriage. Once married, several family-owned properties would automatically qualify for inclusion under the restructuring plan. Victor wouldn't simply recover his loans. He would gain legal influence over assets my parents had spent decades accumulating. Everything had been carefully designed. Not through fraud, through contracts. Contracts my parents had apparently agreed to. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The room felt painfully quiet. I wasn't heartbroken. I was furious. Not because my parents had financial problems. Businesses failed every day. People made mistakes. But instead of telling me the truth, they had tried to solve their crisis by manipulating my future. The next morning, I drove to Bellevue before either of my parents could leave for work. My mother answered the door, wearing a surprised expression. Freya? We weren't expecting you. I need to speak with both of you. She hesitated before stepping aside. My father entered the living room moments later, coffee mug still in his hand. His face immediately became serious. You found something. It wasn't a question. He already knew. I placed copies of the loan documents on the coffee table. Then I added the trust paperwork beside them. Silence filled the room. Neither of my parents touched the papers. Neither denied they existed. Finally, I looked directly at my father. You borrowed millions from Victor. He slowly nodded. Yes. You can't repay it. Another nod. So your solution was arranging my marriage? My mother covered her face with both hands. We didn't know what else to do. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You could have told me the truth. We were ashamed. So instead you lied. My father's shoulder slumped. We thought eventually you might grow to love him. I laughed bitterly. No. Neither of them spoke. After several painful seconds, my father quietly admitted the truth I had already suspected. We signed preliminary agreements months before introducing you. Every muscle in my body went tense. You made plans for my life without asking me. We believed there would never be another chance to save the company. I stood. I don't care about the company. My mother began crying. Please understand. I understand perfectly. I gathered my documents and walked toward the front door. My father called after me. If you walk away now, everything we've built will disappear. Without turning around, I answered calmly. Then maybe you should have protected your daughter before your business. I closed the door behind me. For the first time in my life, I drove away from my parents' house without looking back. I believed I finally understood the entire story. I was wrong. 3 days later, an email arrived from someone whose name I had never seen before. The subject line contained only 6 words. I was Victor's first wife. For several minutes, I simply stared at the email. The sender's name read, Emily Carter. The subject line was impossible to ignore. I was Victor's first wife. I assumed it was a prank. Or maybe someone trying to manipulate me. Still, curiosity won. I opened the message. It was surprisingly short. Freya, if you're reading this, it means Victor has already introduced himself to your family. Please don't ignore this email. I don't want money. I don't want revenge. I only want to stop another woman from making the same mistake I made. If you're willing to listen, meet me tomorrow at 2 p.m. at Harbor Bean Cafe in Tacoma. Come alone. Bring no one you don't completely trust. Emily. There were no dramatic accusations. No emotional language. No demands. Just an invitation. I read it 4 more times. Every instinct told me to be careful. But another instinct, the one that had guided me through years of fraud investigations, told me something else. People who lie usually oversell their story. Emily hadn't. The next afternoon, I drove south to Tacoma. Harbor Bean Cafe sat near the waterfront, tucked between an old bookstore and a small flower shop. The cafe wasn't crowded. Perfect. I arrived 15 minutes early and chose a table where I could clearly see the entrance. Old habits. At exactly 2 o'clock, a woman walked through the door. She looked to be in her mid-40s. Simple clothes. No expensive jewelry. No dramatic entrance. She scanned the room before making eye contact with me. "You must be Freya. And you're Emily." She nodded. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled politely. "I'm glad you came." "So am I." After ordering coffee, we sat in silence until the waitress walked away. Emily reached into her leather bag. Instead of immediately pulling out documents, she asked a question. "Did your parents tell you why Victor wants to marry you?" I answered honestly. "They claim he's looking for a partner." Emily gave a sad smile. "That's exactly what he told me." She slowly placed a thick folder on the table. "I've been waiting years for someone willing to look at this." Inside were dozens of organized documents, property records, corporate filings, copies of checks, emails, legal correspondence. Everything was labeled by date. I looked at her in surprise. "You kept all of this?" "I started collecting evidence after the divorce." "For 2 years." She shook her head. "For almost 8. That answer caught me completely off guard. Emily took a sip of coffee before continuing. "When Victor and I married, I believed I had found someone who genuinely cared about me." She laughed quietly. "I couldn't have been more wrong." She explained that Victor never pressured her directly. Instead, he slowly encouraged financial decisions that sounded completely reasonable. Moving property into trusts, creating joint investment accounts, signing updated estate documents. Everything was presented as responsible planning for their future together. Nothing looked suspicious. Not individually. But over time, ownership quietly shifted. Small changes became larger ones. One signature became another. One transfer led to another. Until one day, very little legally belonged to her anymore. When I finally realized what had happened, Emily said softly, "It was already too late." "Did you sue him?" "I tried." "What happened?" "He never technically broke the law." That sentence frustrated me. "So, he just walked away?" Emily nodded. "With almost everything." She looked directly into my eyes. "The money wasn't even the worst part." "What was?" "He made me believe every decision had been mine." That sentence stayed with me. Manipulation wasn't always loud. Sometimes it looked like agreement. Emily opened another section of the folder. "This is where your situation becomes different." She slid several papers toward me. I immediately recognized Victor's company names. Then I noticed something unexpected. Several businesses connected to Victor had recently started acquiring warehouse properties near Seattle. Some of those addresses looked familiar. Very familiar. I froze. "My father's company rents 2 of these warehouses." Emily nodded. "I know. You investigated my family?" "No." She reached into her bag again. This time she removed an old notebook. "I investigate Victor." She opened it. Every relationship, every business partnership, every major investment, everything was arranged by year. Only then did I realize something shocking. My family wasn't unique. Victor followed patterns. Whenever he became involved with someone personally, a business opportunity always appeared nearby. Sometimes before the relationship, sometimes after, but always connected somehow. It couldn't be coincidence. Emily leaned closer. "I think Victor chooses families long before he chooses wives." I slowly nodded. "I've started thinking the same thing." For nearly 3 hours, we compared notes. Every discovery I had made over the previous weeks matched information Emily had gathered years earlier. Together, the picture became much larger. Victor wasn't targeting individuals. He targeted financially vulnerable families with valuable assets. Marriage simply gave him another layer of legal influence. By the time we finished, the cafe had almost emptied. Outside, rain had begun falling across the waterfront. As we prepared to leave, Emily hesitated. "There's something I haven't told anyone." "What is it?" "I wasn't the only person investigating Victor." That surprised me. "There was someone else?" She nodded. "My attorney." "What happened?" Emily's expression changed. He died before we could file the case. I frowned. An accident? They ruled it accidental. But she looked toward the rain-covered window. I've never been completely convinced. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she handed me a small flash drive. I made digital copies of everything. I accepted it carefully. What do you want from me? Emily answered without hesitation. I want someone who understands financial evidence better than I do. You think we can actually stop him? I think you're the first person who's found the same pattern independently. That gave me hope. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I wasn't fighting alone. Over the following weeks, Emily and I met regularly. Sometimes in Seattle, sometimes in Tacoma, occasionally inside public libraries where we could quietly review records for hours without attracting attention. Piece by piece, we reconstructed Victor's financial network, hidden partnerships, layered corporations, trust agreements, property transfers. Every answer produced 2 new questions. Then one evening, after finishing another meeting, I returned to my apartment feeling cautiously optimistic. The hallway outside my unit looked normal.
My door was still locked.
Nothing appeared disturbed until I stepped inside. Every drawer had been opened. My office had been searched. File cabinets stood empty. Boxes lay overturned across the floor. Oddly, my television remained untouched. My laptop was still sitting on the desk. Cash inside a kitchen drawer hadn't been taken. Only one thing was missing: the folder containing every note from my investigation. Whoever entered my apartment hadn't come to steal valuables. They had come for my evidence. And that meant one terrifying possibility. Someone knew I was getting too close to the truth. I stood frozen in the middle of my apartment. Every cabinet had been opened. Every folder had been searched. My office looked as though someone had carefully examined everything without rushing. It wasn't the kind of mess left behind by burglars looking for jewelry or electronics. It was methodical, professional. I immediately reached for my phone and called 911. Within 30 minutes, 2 Seattle police officers arrived and began documenting the scene. One officer photographed every room while the other asked me a series of questions. Were any electronics taken?
No.
Cash? No. Jewelry? No. So, what was stolen? I pointed toward the empty space on my desk. A folder containing documents from a personal investigation. The officer wrote something into his notebook. Do you know who might have one of those documents? I hesitated. I have suspicions. He looked up. But no proof. Not yet. After they finished processing the apartment, one of the officers handed me a case number. We'll investigate, but I want you to understand something, he said carefully. If someone came only for paperwork, they probably knew exactly what they were looking for. That thought stayed with me long after they left. The following morning, I met Emily at the same cafe where we had first spoken. The moment she saw my face, she knew something had happened. You look exhausted. I slid the police report across the table. They broke into my apartment. Emily's expression immediately hardened. They took the documents? Only the documents. She leaned back in her chair and let out a slow breath. I was afraid this day would come. You expected it? I expected Victor to realize someone was connecting the pieces. I stirred my untouched coffee. If he sent someone, why not take everything? Why leave the laptop? Because computers create investigations. She looked directly at me. Missing paperwork can be explained as ordinary theft. Her answer made uncomfortable sense. Fortunately, whoever entered my apartment hadn't accomplished everything. I smiled for the first time that morning. They stole copies. Emily blinked. What? I never keep original research in one place. I opened my laptop. Every document had already been scanned, backed up, and stored in encrypted cloud storage. Emily laughed quietly. I knew there was a reason I trusted a forensic accountant. For the next several hours, we rebuilt the missing investigation files. Since everything had been organized digitally, replacing the stolen folder was easier than either of us expected. More importantly, the burglary revealed something valuable. Victor, or someone connected to him, felt threatened. That meant we were getting close. A week later, Emily called with unexpected news. I found someone you need to meet.
Who?
An attorney. I already have one. Not like this. She refused to explain further over the phone. Instead, we met at a federal office building in downtown Seattle. Security procedures took nearly 20 minutes before we were escorted into a conference room. Waiting inside was a man in his early 50s wearing a navy suit. He introduced himself. My name is Marcus Hale. We shook hands. I'm an assistant United States attorney. That surprised me. Emily noticed my confusion. I shared some of her evidence with him. Marcus opened a legal pad. I've reviewed everything you've collected. And he folded his hands together. It's impressive. I waited. But proving someone is manipulative isn't enough. I know. We need evidence showing criminal intent. I nodded. Most of what Victor does appears legal. Exactly. Marcus stood and walked toward a whiteboard. He drew several circles connected by arrows. Fraud cases become much stronger when patterns repeat. He pointed toward one circle. You have 2 former marriages. Another circle. You have your parents' loan agreements. Another. You have multiple shell companies. Then he looked directly at me. What we don't have is current activity. I understood immediately. You need him to keep operating. Marcus nodded once. If Victor believes nobody suspects him, he'll continue doing exactly what he's always done. Emily frowned. You want us to wait? I want him to make the next move. Waiting wasn't easy. Weeks passed. Then another month. Life slowly settled into an uncomfortable routine. I returned to work during the day. Evenings were spent reviewing financial records with Emily. Marcus periodically updated us on the growing federal inquiry, but he remained careful not to reveal operational details. One afternoon, he called unexpectedly. I think you'll want to hear this. Emily and I met him that evening. Marcus placed several photographs on the conference table. One image immediately caught my attention. Victor, standing beside a younger woman and her parents. The setting appeared to be a luxury restaurant. What am I looking at? Marcus answered calmly. The daughter's father owns a manufacturing company. Emily slowly exhaled. Financial trouble? Marcus nodded. Significant debt. The pattern was repeating. Different family. Same circumstances. Same Victor. Over the following weeks, investigators quietly monitored Victor's business activity. Search warrants were prepared. Financial analysts examined banking records. Subpoenas uncovered internal communications between several companies connected to his investment network. Unlike his previous dealings, this time investigators were watching in real time. Victor had no idea. Then came the mistake that changed everything. One of Victor's senior financial managers agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for reduced charges in an unrelated tax investigation. The manager provided internal emails, private spreadsheets, hidden ownership records, documents that had never appeared in public filings. For the first time, investigators possessed evidence showing deliberate efforts to conceal beneficial ownership across multiple shell companies. Marcus smiled for the first time since we had met. This, he said, tapping the stack of documents, is what we've been waiting for. Several days later, another phone call came. Don't make any plans for Saturday evening, Marcus said. Why? You may finally get your answer. Saturday arrived with clear skies and unusually warm weather. Victor was hosting an engagement celebration at an upscale country club. Not for me. For the daughter of another businessman. Guests arrived wearing tuxedos and evening gowns. Photographers waited outside. Everything looked elegant. Everything looked perfect. Then black SUVs entered the parking lot. Federal agents stepped out. Within seconds, the music stopped. Conversations disappeared. Guests turned in confusion as investigators approached Victor. He attempted to remain calm. Then one agent presented a federal arrest warrant. Another informed him of multiple financial crime charges. Victor's confident smile disappeared for the first time since I had ever known him. As agents escorted him through the silent crowd, our eyes met briefly across the ballroom entrance. There was no anger in his expression, only disbelief. For years, he had believed he was always the smartest person in every room. That illusion ended in front of hundreds of witnesses. As I watched the vehicles drive away, I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction. Not revenge. Relief. I thought the nightmare had finally ended. I had no idea the hardest conversation of my life was still waiting for me, because 2 years after everything began, Victor reached out from prison with an offer I never expected. 2 years passed faster than I expected. The federal investigation expanded far beyond anything Emily or I had originally imagined. What had started as a single financial fraud case eventually uncovered tax violations, money laundering through shell corporations, falsified ownership disclosures, and conspiracy involving several business associates. Victor Langford was convicted on multiple federal charges. His carefully constructed empire collapsed one company at a time. News outlets covered the trial for weeks. Business magazines that had once praised his success now published detailed timelines explaining how his network had operated behind polished public appearances. For the first time in decades, people saw the real Victor instead of the image he had carefully created. I thought I had finally closed that chapter of my life. Then one Monday morning, an unexpected envelope arrived at my office. There was no return address. Inside was a single letter from Victor's attorney. The message was brief. Ms. Garcia, my client wishes to speak with you regarding information that may be beneficial to both parties. He requests a confidential meeting at Federal Correctional Institution Sheridan. Attendance is entirely voluntary. I read the letter twice. Emily looked at me from across the conference table. You're not seriously considering it. I don't know. What could he possibly have to say? I've asked myself the same question. For several days, I ignored the invitation. Then curiosity won. Not because I trusted Victor, because I wanted to understand why someone who had lost everything suddenly wanted to see me. A week later, I drove to the federal prison in Oregon. Security procedures took nearly an hour. Eventually, a correctional officer escorted me into a small visitation room divided by reinforced glass. Victor entered from the opposite side. He looked older. His hair had turned noticeably grayer. The confidence that had once filled every room he entered seemed noticeably smaller. Yet his posture remained controlled. He picked up the phone connected through the glass. So you came. I wanted answers. He smiled faintly. I expected that. I remained standing for a moment before sitting down. You asked for this meeting. I did. Then start talking. Victor folded his hands. I need your help. I almost laughed. My help. My remaining assets have been frozen. That's not my problem. My former partners are turning against me. You chose your partners. I need someone who understands the financial records. I stared at him in disbelief. After everything he had done, he expected me to help rebuild what investigators had dismantled. You still don't understand. His expression tightened slightly. Understand what? You think losing money is your biggest problem? It is.
No.
I leaned closer. Your biggest problem is that nobody trusts you anymore. Silence settled between us. For the first time since meeting him years earlier, Victor had no clever response. Finally, he spoke again. They exaggerated everything. The jury disagreed. My attorneys made mistakes. The evidence spoke for itself. You helped destroy my life. I shook my head.
No.
You did. You destroyed your own life. His jaw tightened. For a brief moment, I recognized the same arrogance that had convinced him he could manipulate everyone around him. Prison hadn't changed that part of him. He lowered his voice. If you testify that I never intended to deceive your family, some of my appeals become much stronger. There it was. The real reason for the meeting. Not information. Not regret. Another attempt to use people. Just like before. I won't lie for you. You owe me nothing? I owe you exactly what you gave me. And what's that? The truth. I stood. The correctional officer noticed the movement. Victor quickly spoke again. Think carefully. I already have. You'll regret walking away. I smiled politely. I don't think I will. Without another word, I left the visitation room. The drive back to Seattle felt strangely peaceful. For years, Victor had controlled every conversation by convincing people they needed something from him. This time, he needed something from me. And I had finally learned that saying no didn't require guilt. Several weeks later, another difficult conversation arrived. This time it wasn't with Victor. It was with my parents. My mother called unexpectedly. "Freya, could you come over?" Her voice sounded different. Not desperate. Not demanding. Just tired. I hadn't visited their house in almost a year. When I arrived, the changes were impossible to ignore. The expensive cars were gone. The landscaping had become overgrown. Inside, much of the furniture had been sold. Their business had officially entered liquidation months earlier after creditors forced the company into bankruptcy proceedings. The lifestyle they had spent decades protecting no longer existed. We sat around the same dining table where Victor had first been introduced to me. Only this time, no one pretended everything was perfect. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Finally, my father broke the silence. "I've rehearsed this conversation 100 times." He looked older than I remembered. Not because of age. Because of regret. "I'm sorry." Those 2 words filled the room. Not dramatically. Quietly. My mother wiped tears from her eyes. "We convinced ourselves we were protecting the family." I answered honestly. "You were protecting your business." She nodded. "You're right."
My father looked directly at me.
I kept telling myself that once the company recovered, everything would return to normal. It never could. "I know." He took a deep breath. "I should have trusted you with the truth instead of making decisions for you." For the first time since everything began, neither of them defended what they had done. There were no excuses. No attempts to shift blame. Only acceptance. I appreciated that. But forgiveness wasn't as simple as hearing an apology. "I accept that you're sorry," I said quietly. My mother's face brightened slightly. I continued. "But trust isn't something you apologize back into existence." Neither argued. They simply nodded. Over the following months, we slowly rebuilt our relationship. Not through promises. Through consistent actions. Short conversations became longer visits. Holiday dinners returned. Boundaries were respected. Some wounds healed. Others became permanent reminders of what had happened. One afternoon, nearly 6 months later, Emily stopped by my office carrying a large envelope. "I found something while organizing old court records." "What is it?" "You should read it." Inside was a photocopy of an old commercial property dispute from almost 15 years earlier. At first, I didn't recognize the names. Then I saw one that stopped me cold. My grandfather. He had been involved in a legal case against a young real estate investor. The investor's name appeared on the second page. Victor Langford. I slowly looked up at Emily. "This can't be a coincidence." Emily shook her head. "I don't think it is." For the first time, I began to wonder whether Victor had chosen my family long before my parents ever realized he existed. I couldn't stop thinking about the court records Emily had shown me. For years, I believed Victor had entered my parents' lives because they were financially vulnerable. Now another possibility stood in front of me. What if my family had never been chosen by chance? A few days later, Emily and I visited the county archives to request additional documents related to the old property dispute. The original case files had been stored in off-site records, so it took several hours before an archivist returned with several worn boxes. Carefully, we began reading through hundreds of pages. Purchase agreements, survey reports, letters between attorneys, meeting notes. Most of it seemed ordinary. Then I found a handwritten statement from my grandfather. Years before I was born, he had refused to sell a strategically located warehouse property to a young investor who wanted to assemble several adjoining parcels of land. That investor was Victor Langford. According to the documents, Victor had already signed preliminary agreements with other property owners. Without my grandfather's parcel, the entire commercial project collapsed. The financial losses were substantial. Emily quietly looked at me. "He remembered your family name." I nodded slowly. It wasn't about one business deal. We continued reading. Months after losing that project, Victor had written several letters accusing local business owners of deliberately ruining his investment plans. Although nothing in the letters was illegal, one sentence stood out. People who stand in my way eventually discover that every decision has consequences. I read it twice. The wording was cold, calculated. It wasn't proof of a crime, but it revealed something far more important. He never forgot people who challenged him. Years later, when my father's logistics company began struggling financially, Victor had recognized the Garcia name. Instead of avoiding us, he saw an opportunity. My parents believed they had met a wealthy investor willing to rescue their company. Victor saw something completely different. A chance to settle an old score while expanding his business empire. Neither my parents nor I had understood that we were stepping into a plan that had been developing for years. For the first time, every unanswered question finally had an answer. Why had Victor pursued our family so aggressively? Why had he insisted on marriage instead of a simple business partnership? Why had he seemed unusually confident from the very beginning? Because, in his mind, the outcome had already been decided. He expected history to end in his favor. It didn't. A month later, Emily and I visited my grandfather's grave. The cemetery overlooked a quiet hillside outside Seattle. Fresh flowers rested beside the headstone. I stood there for several minutes before speaking. You protected this family once. The wind moved gently through the trees. I just didn't realize I would have to do it again. Emily placed her hand on my shoulder. He'd be proud of you. I smiled softly. I hope so. Life gradually found a new rhythm. With the federal case concluded and Victor's appeals repeatedly denied, the constant stress that had defined the previous 2 years slowly faded. Emily and I decided not to let everything we had learned disappear inside court records and archived evidence. Instead, we built something meaningful from it. Together, we founded a forensic consulting firm that specialized in helping families and small business owners identify financial manipulation before signing complicated contracts. We taught seminars, worked with attorneys, helped nonprofit organizations educate vulnerable families about hidden financial risks. Many of our clients weren't facing criminals. They were simply facing agreements they didn't fully understand. If our experience could prevent even one family from repeating my story, then every difficult day had been worth it. My relationship with my parents continued to improve, although it never returned to what it had once been. Some things cannot be restored exactly as they were. They have to be rebuilt into something new. My father eventually found work as an operations consultant for a transportation company. My mother volunteered at a local community legal clinic, helping people organize financial paperwork before meeting attorneys. Neither tried to erase the past. Instead, they accepted responsibility for it. That mattered more than any apology. One afternoon, while organizing files at my office, I received another letter. This one came from the federal prison. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Victor. For several minutes, I considered throwing it away unopened. Instead, I read it. The letter contained no threats, no requests, no arguments, only a single sentence. I should have stopped trying to win. That was all. No signature beyond his name. No explanation. I folded the letter and placed it inside a file cabinet. Whether those words reflected genuine regret or simple exhaustion no longer mattered. His story was finished. Mine wasn't. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't see at the beginning. The greatest danger wasn't Victor. It was silence. My parents stayed silent because they were ashamed. Victor relied on silence because it protected his schemes. Victims stayed silent because they believed nobody would believe them. The moment people began speaking honestly, everything changed. Truth doesn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it appears one document at a time. One conversation at a time. One difficult decision at a time. I nearly lost my future because the people closest to me believed fear was stronger than honesty. In the end, honesty proved stronger than all of it. If there's one lesson my experience taught me, it's this. Never allow anyone to convince you that your future is a bargaining chip for someone else's mistakes. Ask questions. Read every agreement. Trust actions more than promises. And never be afraid to walk away when something doesn't feel right. Thank you for spending time with me and following my story from beginning to end. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more original stories filled with family drama, mystery, justice, and unexpected twists, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story. Until next time, take care of yourself and never underestimate the power of the truth.